All right, let's start our webinar. Welcome everyone to our webinar After the Vote, Understanding the New Political Climate, hosted by the French-American Foundation. We're thrilled to have you join us for this important post-election discussion. The French-American Foundation fosters dialogue and understanding between France and the United States on key transatlantic issues. And one of our signature programs is the Transatlantic Forum. And it engages professionals in meaningful conversations like this one on contemporary challenges. Before the election, we hosted a Transatlantic Forum dinner in September featuring today's speakers, Tracy Sefl and Doug Heye. Welcome, Tracy. Welcome, Doug. So good to see you again. During that dinner, they shared valuable insights on the political landscape, and we're excited to have them back today to discuss the election outcome. And our moderator today is Leon Levy, our valued Transatlantic Forum member. A little bit about our speakers. Tracy is a seasoned Democratic strategist and consultant who has advised presidential campaigns and worked extensively in media relations and messaging. Doug Heye is a Republican communications expert and former Deputy Chief of Staff for the House Majority Leader. He also served as Communications Director for the Republican National Committee. Leon Levy, our moderator today, brings extensive experience in geopolitical and strategic advising, having worked at Goldman Sachs and the Eurasia Group. He's a valued member of the Transatlantic Forum community, and we're happy to have you all on this webinar today. Questions in the Q&A at the bottom, and we will have a brief Q&A session at the end. And we look forward to a very thought-provoking discussion on these very monumental election results. I'm handing it over to you, Leon. Take it away, and we're excited to speak to you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Cindy, for the introduction, for bringing us all together, and for all the great work that you are doing with the French-American Foundation. As Cindy said, my name is Leon, and I've spent the vast majority of my career in geopolitics, thinking about them, writing about them, analyzing them. And I remain so struck about the fact that almost a decade after he became the central figure in US politics, maybe even global politics, but that Donald Trump remains very much a wild card, which is why I'm so thrilled today to be joined by both Tracy and Doug to help unpack both how we got here, as well as the way forward for the Trump administration, for the US public, and for the world. So Tracy, Doug, let's jump right in. Let's start really macro, big picture. And Doug, let me direct this question to you. Do you think that these election results reveal anything fundamentally different about the US electorate, or are they more reflective of just the current environment, like inflation, migration worries, and whatnot?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. And let me say, as a bit of a preface, I had dinner last night with a friend who tonight is going to be on his way to Beaune for the Vent du Vent and the Hospice de Beaune. And he gave me, so the timing on this is amazing. He gave me this book, Spécialités de la Maison, from 1947 by the American Friends of France, which maybe is a precursor to this organization. So I thought the timing on that was great. And yeah, it's been a big week. And I think there are a lot of things that we can learn about the decisions that voters made, both for what it says about where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. I start sort of first and foremost with sort of a contrarian take on the election, as my Democratic friends are doing a lot of soul searching and hand wringing, as you typically will do after losing a race, and as you definitely will do after losing to Donald Trump, that the parameters of this race were by and large normal ones, at least in the general election. And that is that the Democratic nominee, and yes, there was upheaval because it wasn't the incumbent Democratic president and so forth, but otherwise this was a very traditional election. The nominee of the incumbent party that was unpopular with voters and underwater on two of the biggest issues, and certainly the number one issue being the economy and inflation, number two being the border, lost. That's a very normal thing to happen. And in any other context, I don't think that this would be shocking or a surprise. But it's Donald Trump who won, and it's Donald Trump who won the popular vote, which he clearly did not do in 2016. And that's where we get some of the real sort of insights into are there shifts in voter patterns that are happening? Is this a realignment and so forth? And I don't think anybody at this point is smart enough to tell you if there's a realignment. But certainly there are cracks in the Democratic coalition, as we've seen with the increase in support for Trump especially with Hispanic voters, to some extent African American voters, and voters that Democrats were banking on not showing up at the levels that they needed. The one issue that gave me pause that Trump may not win, because otherwise, all the atmospherics suggested that he should and would, was on the issue of abortion. And what we had seen in the midterm elections and special elections, basically every opportunity that Democrats had to show that women voters are active and massively supporting and delivering wins for Democrats. Obviously, it didn't happen in this race. We can talk down ballot, certainly. And one stat showed that a quarter of pro-choice women supported Donald Trump. That starts to make the math very difficult for Kamala Harris. The increase in Hispanic voters being another example. Certainly Hispanic men and African American men. And so what we're seeing is our voters potentially saying, yeah, we don't like some of the woke stuff that we've seen. We don't like the Latinx. Hispanics don't call themselves Latinx and so forth. But there's also a big reality here that they were upset about the same things that voters throughout the country were. They don't like what things cost. They're upset about what's going on the border. They have real concerns about violent crime in the country. And so, that's why I say I don't want to overinterpret what happened in these results yet. If this was a realignment, we're going to find out that I think in future years, not in the next 6 weeks or 6 months and so forth. And given that we saw a lot of Democratic Senate candidates overperform Harris, tells us also that there may be more here than meets the eye. The other thing I would say is in the how did we get here, the Republican primary. Given everything that we know about Donald Trump and everything that happened on January 6th and before and in courtrooms, Trump should never have been the nominee. But I go back to the first Republican debate where the first question was, raise your hand if you would support Donald Trump if he were convicted of a felony. And pretty much every hand went up, except for Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson, every hand went up. And I watched that debate with a couple of Republican friends and said, well, I guess we can turn the TV off. This campaign is over. And essentially it was in that, even though Nikki Haley, sort of turned it on at the end, I went to one of her last events and the atmosphere in that room was real. But if your starting point in a primary campaign is, I'm not going to attack my opponent on the thing that he could be most vulnerable on, and that I would attack any other opponent in any other race on, it said that the game was pretty much over at that point. And that's how we got Donald Trump. And at that point then, given the state of the economy and the right track, wrong track that voters had, made obviously Donald Trump's victory last week very possible.
Thank you, Doug. That makes a lot of sense. Tracy, let me shift the conversation over to your side to give us a little bit from the Democratic perspective. I guess it's the same basic question to you is, how did the Democrats end up in this position? And do you think that these results reveal anything fundamentally different about where Democrats were a week ago versus today?
Thanks, Leon. And it's nice to be here with all of you. I have worked now on 6 presidential campaigns in various capacities. And what's become very, very clear to me is that over the course of those 6 campaigns, and as we move forward, this is a country in the midst of its own transformation. Some would argue it's on par with the agricultural revolution or the industrial revolution. What we see in this country might be considered sort of an IT revolution. Information and technology has fundamentally changed not just the structures of our society, but the inputs that voters receive. And as this massive transformation has been taking place, the Democratic Party has not fully enveloped itself around these transformative steps and processes that are underway. And perhaps a shorter way to say that is to say that we don't yet know how to speak to voters. And that isn't just in terms of language choice or labels, but also in terms of how voters actually receive information. That the propensity for a voter to have watched ads or tuned into a rally or a town hall or followed along on some sort of social media, it is such an overstatement of what voters are actually doing, that information is so much lower for voters than what the party structure is assuming. The amount of money spent on television ads that very few voters actually watch, but more voters than talk about, has created a feedback loop that has not helped Democrats and certainly did not help Democrats in this election. The other fundamental transformation that has been occurring alongside all of these information and technological changes is that Donald Trump has shattered the norms of the presidency. He has shattered them by willful ignoring of traditions and conventions that have been entrenched in our politics and in our government. He shattered them the first time around. He's shattering them even further this time around. And so the challenge for Democrats is not only to figure out how we live through and improve upon our lives in this state of transformation, but to do so as the floor falls out, as the norms are shattered. This is a tremendously disturbing, scary, sad, and hugely unknown moment that we are stepping into. And I say that as someone who's certainly deeply disappointed with the race outcome, but also deeply disappointed with the race, period. And so as we continue this conversation, those are some of the things that underpin a lot of my thoughts.
If I can add real quick. So I agree with a whole lot of that. The other fundamental of political campaigns are the candidates. And Democrats found themselves in a box, right? Joe Biden never walked off into the sunset. And so then obviously the debate was a disaster. And he stepped down. So then he was left with Kamala Harris. And when Harris became very clearly the nominee, the question I had for a lot of folks was, is Kamala Harris a good candidate or not? Okay, we know everything about Donald Trump, and no one is ever going to change their mind on him. So is Kamala Harris a good candidate? And this is when, people were using words like coconuts and brat and joy and all that. So Democrats would tell me, oh my God, yes. And I would say, okay, why? And they couldn't really do that. And so, we were in this campaign where, yeah, she raised a whole lot of money. Now we're learning some of the spending wasn't great. I'd also argue that doesn't necessarily matter, but she wasn't a great candidate. So if we look at the conversation that we've had sort of in the last week of the campaign and now in this week after, this conversation of, well, she should have gone on Joe Rogan's show. Well, if that means acknowledging thinking differently about how you communicate, I get it. But Kamala Harris goes on Joe Rogan and says what? If she did that interview, my guess is it wouldn't have gone very well. And so Trump beat a not great candidate who was running as a incumbent VP of an administration that wasn't popular. So that's why I try and be mindful of not over-interpreting results. You know, there were a lot of things that counted against Democrats here. Some of them were basic fundamentals.
Yeah, I think you both make a lot of good points, and it's so interesting because you both seem to be agreeing on the fact that, the rules of the game have changed, but it's not really clear what parameters of the game have changed. Is it more because, traditionally speaking, Kamala had the fundraising advantage, right? But maybe offset with the fact that she might not necessarily have been the greatest candidate. On the other hand, you had Trump, who is one of the most unorthodox candidates, and he pulled it out in a way that we haven't seen. So the rules are changing. I think to both your points, we just don't know how yet. But that's talking a little bit about what came before. Let's talk now about what's going to come ahead of us. And we have this unusual situation in that, the president-elect is somebody who has actually served as president before, which is something that doesn't really happen in U.S. politics, save for one previous exception. Do we actually expect a sizable difference between Trump 1.0 versus Trump 2.0? Is it just going to be more shattering of norms? Is it going to be a fundamental shift in policy? Tracy, let's kick it off with you, and then Doug would love to hear you jump in as well.
Yes, I think we can expect to see meaningful differences between his first term and now this second term. Yes, we will continue to see the shattering of norms, and yes, we will continue to see the outcome of policies that he spoke of, see how that's actually enacted, how it's operationalized. I expect I expect it to be an incredibly destabilizing time where things will be happening very fast. I know that there is a well-reported sense of fear among just the federal workforce, not knowing what may lie ahead in terms of abolishing the Department of Education or stripping down the National Institutes of Health and its research portfolio. The concerns that the federal workforce has, I think, can't be understated because they will bear the brunt of both the norm shattering and the policy operations. So I do expect that to continue to happen. I also think a meaningful difference that we will see is the the growth of Trump's bench, if you will, that the first time around it was still such a shocking new thing, and he seemed to be plucking people from sometimes obscure, sometimes weird, sometimes both places. This time, it seems clear that there are more people who we would call a loyalist, that he's actually built up this crowd of loyalists. And this 2.0 is the opportunity to install them in various positions with power, with political as well as policy agendas. And that bench has grown. That to me suggests that things will go in a much sharper turn as opposed to slight changes.
Got it. Doug, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we're starting to see some of it now. So you just had Senate Republicans finish. There's a lot happening, right? Trump was on Capitol Hill, met with House Republicans. The House Republicans are going to have a small majority, but I doubt you'll see a lot of the sort of nonsense that we've seen in the past 2 years. And I say that because Trump is there. Having an incumbent president instills discipline within House Republicans. You've just had Senate Republicans in the past 5 or 10 minutes confirm that John Thune is going to be their leader. Thune is not a Donald Trumpy guy. So you have some independence on Capitol Hill, but it's a much Trumpier Republican conference than it was in 2016. That now you also have an incoming administration where we're just starting to see some names come out. Now, Susie Wiles is going to be the chief of staff, the first female chief of staff that we've had in our history. I have no doubt that Donald Trump will take a lot of credit for being that trailblazer, cracking that glass ceiling and so forth. She's also an experienced pro. And what's going to be interesting to see over the coming weeks and months, I don't expect that she's somebody who would last for 3 or 6 months in that role, by the way, is how is she going to manage her role as far as being a guardrail for some of Trump's worst impulses, and also what we call feeding the beast, helping some of those or distracting him from doing A by doing B and so forth. And we're starting to see some of the personnel. And what we've seen initially is more foreign policy than domestic. Secretary of State, obviously, UN ambassador, and so forth. A lot of what we've heard on those, especially with Marco Rubio, has been positive. John Fetterman, the Democratic senator from Pennsylvania, raved about Rubio and said that he would support him, which suggests an easy glide path for that nomination. But what we've seen with that national security advisor as well is these are people who are going to be very tough on China. So if I'm President Xi in Beijing, I'm not loving the picks that I've seen so far from Trump. Now, Pete Hegseth from Fox News going to DOD, that may be somewhat of a mitigating factor there. I think we'll have to see. And we haven't heard a lot from Senate Republicans really supporting this yet. This is where there's a difference between what a lot of them think privately versus what they'll say publicly on this. And this again, Donald Trump remains a wild card, Leon, as you said, at the beginning. And for somebody that is so well known to remain a wild card is a challenge to assess what they'll do. The question for Europe is obviously a big one, not just with funding of NATO, what happens with Ukraine, what happens with Poland for that matter, Moldova, that become real questions, but also the issue of tariffs. Trump has talked a lot about tariffs. Does he start with China? Does he go to, Europe with that? I emailed a friend who's a winemaker in Chablis on Monday and said, what's your plan for tariffs? Because he had to deal with them, 4 or 5 years ago when that was not in theory but in practice. And these are the things that the global community is looking at, and it does mean that Europe has to step up and do a bigger role of taking care of Europe. They can't depend on the United States the way that they did, before Election Day on 2016. We can have conversations of, where that's good, where that's bad. What does that mean for France? What does that mean for Germany? Certainly, and Angela Merkel is going to be in town next week, selling her book, and as an editorial comment. Wow, we are learning what a disappointment Angela Merkel was compared to what we thought, 5 or 10 years ago. These are very real questions for Europe, and they're global questions. And Trump is going to keep people guessing. And part of that is intentional. Part of that is who he is. And the third part of it is he's in an advanced age. We focused obviously on Joe Biden a whole lot. Obviously, Joe Biden was never too old for Democrats until the moment he wasn't the nominee. Now Donald Trump's going to be too old, but he's old in an age that ages you faster. And so what happens with Donald Trump over the next 18 months, 36 months is going to be very interesting to watch. And then lastly, I would say, once we have the midterm elections, Donald Trump becomes a lame duck. And how Republicans pivot away from Trump, especially those Republicans who were either elected this year in the Senate or elected 2 years from now in the Senate, meaning they don't have to toe Donald Trump's line anymore, is going to be something to watch as well.
Thanks, Doug. A lot of good points in that. And I do want to shift the conversation a bit more towards the global aspect, some of which you touched on, sort of Europe's role in all this, and definitely China. But before we do that, one final question on the U.S. domestic side. A lot of the analysis that we've been seeing over the course of the last week has that Trump won on the economy, That was a big concern of voters, and a lot of voters thought that Trump could handle the economy more. On the other hand, we are dealing with inflation here, and a lot of Trump's proposals, economists are saying increasing tariffs, limiting migration are inflationary. And so a question for you, Tracy, or you, Doug, or whoever wants to jump in here, but how much leeway do we think that Donald Trump has when it comes to the US economy? And how important is sort of the US economy to America's global standing and all the other things that it wants to do in the world? Tracy, you want to jump in with that one first?
Well, certainly the U.S. economy is as central to the progress that can be made in this country, as well as the standing that this country has in the world. An economy that's, if we do see increased inflation, if we do see all of the worrying trends escalate, not only is that a destabilization on the global stage, but I think at a very micro practical level, there are a lot of people who voted for Trump who would be experiencing pain as a result of Trump. And it's that dissonance that is going to really shape what's ahead. It will shape the speed at which Trump makes decisions. It will shape the tenor of those decisions and just how severe a certain policy may be. Because in the process of all of this, he will be showing voters, they will be experiencing the things that they thought for sure they would not experience. This notion that I will be better off under Trump because he's not the incumbent guy and the incumbent woman, he's going to be better for me. That can very quickly disappear and instead be left with voters who are saying, wait a second, this is not what we thought we were signing up for. So how that gets navigated is perhaps the central question inside the Trump White House. And I will also say I'm glad Doug mentioned Ms. Wiles as the first female chief of staff. Of course, it's also worth remembering that she was a corporate lobbyist, and in that regard, gender is sort of notwithstanding in this case. But we'll take the wins for the gender when we get them. But again, on a more serious note, certainly the potential for very destabilizing economic activity in this country has electoral implications that will really happen fast. And we're talking midterm fast. We're talking special election fast. And I know that this conversation we're having today will sort of live on beyond literally today, November 13th. But this truly is a monumental day with even the visual of Trump and Biden sitting next to each other in front of a rather roaring fire. And the news that we now see John Thune emerging from that secret vote as majority leader. Right there's a whole lot to unpack, Leon. So let's keep your questions going.
Thank you, Tracy. Doug, thoughts on the importance of the U.S. economy to Trump's agenda, both at home and abroad? And
it's obviously very important. And so Trump's margin now, Trump has still won the popular vote, but it looks like he's going to fall short of 50, right? So he'll be at 49.8 or something like that. And the 50 was a big psychological number for him. He's still going to claim it, I think. But it highlights he doesn't have much room for error. And if we look at polling on Donald Trump, he's never been above water. He's always been below water, which means, why did he win? Well, one, a lot of people don't really like him, voted for him. And ultimately, I think a big part of that was they were saying to Kamala Harris, tell us who you are and what you're going to do. And Kamala Harris wouldn't do it. And the past 2 weeks of the campaign, the last 2 weeks of the campaign or about Donald Trump's a fascist. And people don't go to the grocery store and come home and talk about Donald Trump's a fascist. They talk about what they just spent. And that becomes a part of the vulnerability for Trump here if that prices aren't coming down. So can he get to a point where voters feel better? That's a risky proposition to start with. Add to that tariffs and so forth, and that pain could become very real very quickly. Now, his base isn't going to go anywhere, but that's where we could see cracks in the Republican coalition. And with a small Senate majority and a small House majority, very easy to see whatever the Trump legislative agenda is, and I don't think anybody's smart enough to tell you what that is yet, come to a screeching halt in 2 years. Or, Tracy referenced special elections. Steve Scalise joked yesterday, but it wasn't a joke. Hey, Donald Trump, don't take any more of our House members. We need them, because they do need them. And, if you're Mike Walls from Florida or Elise Stefanik from New York, now you're going into the administration. One, you're out of Congress. Two, you're going to have a special election that you could win, but you could lose. And clearly, immigration is going to be, a big component of that as well. And while I think my friends in most of the mainstream media are defining that by using the words mass deportation over and over and over again, my guess is that's not what we're going to see from Donald Trump. And I look at it in the terms of what Donald Trump would do with executive orders. And he would sit at his desk in the Oval Office. He would sign some document, might not really have any teeth in it, but he would then hold it up and say, look what I did. And that's something that Obama, Bush, Clinton, on down the line, they never really did it like that. And so it was a very smart way to show action, even if you weren't really doing much. So I think we'll see some of that with Trump, with a focus on actually doing some things, meaning we've just deported this drug dealer, this murderer, this criminal, and holding up who that person is and saying they're out of the country because I got them out of the country. And even with economic hardship, Trump will benefit from that because he'll get credit for voters for getting bad people out. And you'll have, some Democrats who will say, well, he's Willie Hortoning people or whatever. And the reality is George H.W. Bush won on the Willie Horton issue. And if Donald Trump is kicking out drug dealers and rapists and thieves and murderers, he's going to win on the deportation issue as well. And it's going to be very unlikely that we see, especially in heavily agricultural areas, roundups of 40 people and so forth. And could there be family separations? Yes. Families are separated anytime anybody's arrested. But Trump's going to, I think, highlight it in a very smart way of one bad person at a time. And that's where, even as we have some economic pain, he can assuage that or mitigate that to some extent by trying to direct the news into the direction he wants it to go.
Got it.
It occurs to me listening to that, Doug. I just want to say, I'm envisioning a Sharpie presidency. We know how he loves his Sharpie and his big, tall signature, and he understands the power of the visuals. So it just really struck me in this moment that we're in for a Sharpie presidency.
Yeah, and so Donald Trump says this guy was kicked out of America, came back in Joe Biden's administration, and I've thrown this guy out after he killed these 3 people. He's going to get credit for it. And we will think of how much Donald Trump still talks about Hillary Clinton. He's going to talk about Joe Biden a lot over the coming 4 years.
I think you both make a solid point that the optics matter a lot here, and we're going to get a whole host of optics over the next 4 years, particularly on the domestic side that is targeting domestic audiences. But let's shift the conversation a little bit more global now. And Doug, you already touched on this, so I'm going to ask you the first question. But, much of the U.S. domestic audience and even the U.S. economy is really impacted by this relationship between the U.S. and China. And obviously, this is constantly evolving. And, Trump has, in certain instances, shown that he's willing to employ very big rhetoric But then the policies that follow might not necessarily reflect that rhetoric and are more nuanced. So just to start with you, how do you see the U.S.-China relationship evolving over the next 4 years of Trump? And is this going to be um, a major focus area for him and for the American public, do you think?
Yeah, in short, it's going to be a lot of bombast. We could say that about sort of everything. But in American politics, Republican or Democrat, you're never penalized for being too tough on China, right? That's a sentence that just does not exist in our vernacular, and that benefits Trump. And as we see with picks like Rubio, whenever Rubio would go after Trump, while Trump was president, it was on not being tough enough on China. Mike Walls, a China hawk. Elise Stefanik, a China hawk. So we're going to see and hear a lot of rhetoric from them on that. What comes out of that policy, is going to be threats certainly of tariffs. We'll see if that happens because retaliation becomes very real on that. But also, it looks like Trump, at least for now, will continue when it comes to Taiwan. That's where things get very real. And it would be very easy to envision or it'd be very easy to see the possibility that instead of Russia going into Ukraine, that China could have gone into Taiwan and done so first. And China, looking at us now withdrawing from Ukraine potentially, Mike Johnson said, he's not going to pass another Ukraine funding bill. I just said it this morning, that China says, well, maybe we can do whatever we want. And, that's one place where the rubber obviously will meet the road on this. And they have to make a bet on what Trump will do. Is Trump somebody who's ultimately going to back down because Republicans may back down as well? Or is he the madman who's capable of doing anything? And Trump views his own strategic ambiguity on that as benefiting him. I think ultimately, we just have to wait and see how that plays out. But Trump does like to tell, political opponents, foreign or domestic, that he's willing to shoot the hostage. He's just never been put really in the situation where he's shot the hostage. And, NATO funding is a good example of that and so forth. And that's where he's going to continue. We just don't know how far that goes yet.
Tracy, would love to hear your thoughts on sort of both the U.S.-China relationship, as well as, but to add on to it, if Trump is really pursuing the strategic ambiguity and bringing back to this audience here, how does Europe react to all that? Yeah, let's start with that, and then we're going to shift the conversation a bit to Ukraine as well. So.
Well, in his first term, of course, Trump applied the Section 301 tariffs, which had bipartisan support, and certainly we have seen the outcome of a stronger steel and aluminum sector. So there is a smart application of tariffs that we can see and hope for. Our tariffs can also be applied for economic as well as national security reasons. And it's worth remembering in the pandemic, when you had the massive global supply chain disruptions, that there were emergency provisions put in place to sort of shore up our domestic manufacturing. And that was an opportunity to show that it is possible to do this kind of leveling the playing field, if you will. And if I recall correctly, there is a bill sitting before this Congress called Leveling the Playing Field, which would be a policy tool for Trump to support and utilize, that it would force him to say if and when tariffs would be levied, that there would be actual and defined cheating happening by China in particular, and that it's first you show that cheating as a prerequisite to any sort of tariff imposition. and as well to then consider both the national security and the economic considerations. So if in fact that is the framework that he would operate in, I do think it's possible that there would be bipartisan support for Trump in this strong, hawkish approach to China, because Doug is right. That is not something you can go too far on. And at the same time, China's growth is having its own sort of blips where we see in production and consumption. Perhaps another defining characteristic with China and US relations is on the issue of human rights and what the approach is to things like forced labor in that country, and how strongly is Trump willing to go when you have companies like his best friend's Musk's endeavors, or the Tim Cook's Apple, that have such deeply embedded manufacturing inside China that they don't want Trump to mess with that. They don't want him to highlight human rights abuses and labor violations and the forced labor that we do know is happening in that country. So that to me is one of the questions on the China relations that, and perhaps this is where there's conjoining with Europe to stand together in the name of human rights, and in saying that this country, China, would be punished both through tariffs and through applications of policies like the Leveling the Playing Field Act, and with a true mechanism for protecting human rights. It's that last piece that I think is a troubling one for Democrats.
Yeah. Well, it's as no shortage of people have said, it is probably the most complicated geopolitical relationship from which so much else depends on. And there is some component of China, but let's leave aside more of the China thing and move this more to Europe as well, which is Ukraine. And obviously, Donald Trump has made very clear over the last few months that he does not necessarily support Ukraine the way that Joe Biden supports Ukraine. Let's first of all, what do you think will happen with the war in Ukraine upon Trump taking office? And I think more importantly for the crowd assembled here, what does Europe do as a result of that? And with the caveat that there's still so many unknowns here. Doug, Tracy, would anybody like to go first with this jump ball?
Yeah, sure.
Come on, Doug, you've got all the levers of power.
Yeah. Thank God somebody volunteered, because I was just going to make a decision.
The short answer is I don't know what's going to happen. But another funding bill seems extremely unlikely. And, I'll tell you, Leon and everyone, it was 2 years ago that I sent an email to a colleague in London who works at a geopolitical firm and said, keep your eye on House Republicans on Ukraine. There are cracks. And those cracks have only gotten wider. Now, I think those cracks are stupid, but they're there. And there's real, obviously, nervousness about what that means. And now that you have a Republican House, Republican Senate, and Republican presidency, unless Zelensky is somehow able to, appeal to Trump's ego in such a way, as Macron did with the Bastille Day parade or something, it just seems very unlikely that could happen. Now, and you've got also dueling things of Trump. One, he understands the visual image. And when Boris Johnson was in trouble as prime minister, he twice went to Ukraine, and those images buttressed him for a bit. But Trump is also not going to go to a war zone, not just because it's not safe for an American president, but because, his rhetoric about not great countries and, all of that in the past. But if I'm Europe, I try and push for, however you can on funding, but it also means from the US, but that also means that Europe has to stand up more and step up more. And, I've been to Poland 3 times in the last 3 years, and I understand how real it is there. Because if somebody in Poland, in Wrocław or Krakow, sees you and they know you're American, I still don't know why I look American, but apparently I do. They're going to stop you and they're going to tell you. And the anti-Putin material that you see, there are more anti-Putin murals in Wrocław, Poland, than there are, pro Ruth Bader Ginsburg murals in D.C., which is to say a whole hell of a lot. It's very serious to them. Well, they've got to step up now and be prepared for that. And that means working with, all of the NATO countries to say not so much that, we're on our own, but that we can't depend on one of our partners the way that we probably over-relied on them for a long time.
Tracy, anything you'd like to add to this question before we open it up to some Q&A?
Well, I'm just reminded of how often it is that Doug and I can agree on many things. And I would only add that in my conversations with members of the diplomatic press corps, the people on Blinken's plane, there's an expectation that flattery will get them everywhere with Trump, and don't antagonize him. I think those are the two clear political postures that we can expect to see European leaders taking, even with that growing divide, as Doug vividly describes through the counting of murals in Eastern Europe. I think Eastern Europe could perhaps be a better barometer than our traditional, more Central and Western Europe. But nonetheless, Macron was one of the first phone calls that Trump made, and I think that's of note. But moreover, this is an opportunity for European leaders to continue what they did in the first term, which is flatter the man, throw him all the parades, etc., and do not antagonize. And if those are the postures that leaders are going to stick to, perhaps that minimizes some potential disruptions. But most of all, I will simply reiterate that we do not know. And any leader is wise to just be engaged in pretty endless scenario planning. That's the only way that anyone can be looking at this, not through predictions, but through those actual scenarios and tabletop exercises.
Got it. Well, I mean, thank you both for those answers. We've sort of unpacked the U.S.-China relationship and the U.S.-Russia relationship, both as they relate to Europe. But I would like to ask one of these questions that have come here and through the audience, taking a step back for a more macro picture. This person asks, given the current political climate in the U.S., how do you see the election results impacting transatlantic relations, particularly with key allies in Europe? Are there specific areas such as trade, defense, or climate cooperation that you will see significant shifts? We've already talked a little bit about the defense side of things and sort of the navigating China and Russia, but are there areas of cooperation that you both see between the U.S. and Europe in Trump 2.0? And if so, where will we see them? Again, this is a jump ball question. Anybody who wants to jump in?
I'll start with, I'll start by saying that I think perhaps the biggest collective fear and concern that our allies may have is on climate and on the potential for macro sort of unimaginable consequences of decisions that those around him have been promoting and espousing for some time now. So where the concern is greatest in my read of things, it would certainly be on climate. I'll also say it's as we have this conversation in a sober and clear-eyed way, we have to still remember that there is an avowed white supremacist who is going to be the deputy chief of staff inside the White House. That is not inconsequential. And that is not something that was just like throw it around during the campaign and forget about it. We're talking about one of his most trusted advisors whose worldview is grossly in conflict with our allies and is grossly autocratic and fascist. And while voters didn't either listen, care, appreciate, understand, whatever it may be, these kinds of labels, we're still talking about people for whom those labels are accurate. So again, we don't know. We can't predict. All we know is norms will be shattered. He is an extraordinarily malleable person. Again, through flattery, we see how that works. If climate is where the concerns are the greatest, it will be most interesting to see how leaders enact on those strategies.
Got it. Doug, do you see any scope for cooperation or even antagonism between Europe and the US under Trump 2.0?
Well, antagonism, certainly. And it's, sort of to Tracy's point, anything that's not flattery is antagonism to Donald Trump. And I'm reminded by, a conversation I had with a British diplomat when Trump was president previously, who said, said out loud, I wonder if there was ever really a special relationship, which in big bright letters to me was bad question, because that's how Trump views things. But because he reacts like a 6-year-old does to flattery, it can tell you on some things, where that roadmap is. And, we're hearing a lot about tariffs, obviously. Okay, well, what's the flip side on that on trade? What is the deal that, you can cut, on various commodities that make Donald Trump a deal maker? That thing that he's always sold himself as that he's never really done, right? Like, I'm convinced that if Donald Trump had thought a little differently and had some different aides around him, in his first presidency, he could have cut the deal on immigration, like the bill that Democrats supported earlier this year, or a deal on guns that no Republican president otherwise would have been able to cut. And that Donald Trump wins re-election with 56% of the vote because he is the great deal maker and probably gets an immigration or a infrastructure bill as well. But those opportunities, I think, are going to be, fewer and far between, in part because Europe is looking at an America that is retreating to some extent from the world. There's conversations right now about, is Marco Rubio a hawk or a neocon, right? And those are within the Republican Party. That shows you sort of how the GOP, and especially the more Trump part of the GOP, views things like that. And I think that's where we're just going to continue to have real difficulties over the next few years moving forward. And part of that, let me say, is because Donald Trump was reelected a second time. Being elected once is potentially an aberration. Being elected a second time is sort of a confirmation. And in that regard, forget that 70% of the country thought we were moving in the wrong direction and therefore made it possible for Trump to win. It confirmed essentially the 2016 decision that, caused real, heartburn and panic in Europe.
Speaking of heartburn and panic in Europe, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask NATO. Do we see sort of the evolution of NATO being separate from the Russia-Ukraine war? Or this is a drum that Trump has kept beating on for many, many years. And I think many Europeans just didn't want to deal with this issue, but they're going to be confronted with this issue come January 20th. So any thoughts on NATO?
Look, Trump realized that NATO had it pretty good for a long time because we were footing most of the bills. And, contributions that countries were supposed to make, they would often fall short on, and we'd take care of it. And, Trump was able to frame it in a way that he was able to sell it to at least his base in a very successful way. Now, I thought it was a good for us that we had, an outsized role at NATO. But clearly, European countries are going to have to think about not just their contributions, but their roles in NATO somewhat differently because of this. And not all of that is bad. I mean, yes, if I'm Belgium, do I want to write bigger checks? Obviously not. But with that comes more responsibility that could provide opportunities for those countries, and certainly for the United States. We're viewing that. A lot of Americans are viewing that as not necessarily the worst thing in the world. I say that as somebody who thinks that NATO is sacrosanct, and don't even think about shooting the hostage, much less ever talk about it. But that's unfortunately the situation we find ourselves in.
I have considerable agreement.
That's great. I'm glad that we are able then to end this on a point of an agreement before we turn it back to Cindy. Doug, Tracy, thank you so much for engaging in these very complicated questions. And we didn't even get to cover everything going on in the world. So again, really thank you for taking the time and for your candor and for being with us here. Cindy, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Doug, for your time, and Leon for preparing these wonderful questions that enlightened us and hopefully understand Trump 2.0, as you coined it, a little better. Thank you all for tuning in. This recording will be available on our Sefl YouTube channel very soon. And everyone who didn't catch all of it or wants to tune in again, it's free to do that on our YouTube channel. Thank you so much. If anyone would like to know more about the foundation or joining the Transatlantic Forum, feel free to shoot us an email, and we're happy to have you join the forum. Thank you both again for your insights. It was a fantastic webinar. We appreciate you and your time. And Leon, thank you again. And everyone else, have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.